Boldwood presents Heartache at Blackberry Farm, written by Rosie Clarke and read by Claire Morgan. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1, July 1940, Blackberry Farm. Pam Talbot stood staring out of the window, a sigh escaping her lips. There was one of those early mists that sometimes crept across the low-lying fields of the fens, even in summer. The land lay at the bottom of the hill in Meeple, just a mile or so from the village of Sutton, and only a few miles from the cathedral city of Ely in Cambridgeshire. It was a pleasant area, the fields opposite graced with chestnut trees, and the surrounding fields with hedges that in autumn were laden with blackberries. At the moment, the fields were golden with ripening wheat, or green with crops like potatoes and sugar beet. A little frown creased Pam's brow as she turned from the window. She ought to be accustomed to misty mornings after so many years of living on Blackberry Farm as Arthur's wife. But it wasn't the dull day that was weighing so heavy on her heart, nor was it the grey sky or the unseasonable chill in the air. It was the war with Germany that had been raging for months now that was plaguing her mind. Especially after the trauma and horrendous suffering at Dunkirk, when the British army had been trapped on the beaches, some dying, raked by enemy fire, others wounded, hungry, and unable to escape the merciless attacks. Only the bravery of British fishermen and boat owners had saved many more of them from slaughter. When harassed by enemy planes, the Navy couldn't get in close enough to take them away. Fortunately, hundreds of small boats had gone out to help, and much of the stranded army had been saved. But the war was far from over. "We should be so lucky," Pam said to herself as she saw the headlines in her husband's copy of the Times. She'd been collecting the old papers, which carried terrible pictures and headlines of the recent disaster, the occupation of the Channel Islands by German troops, and what was described as the first daylight bombing raid on the British mainland, to make firelighters, and they didn't make for happy reading as she flicked through them, making sure there was nothing Arthur wanted to keep. Her husband was a keen reader and also liked to do the crosswords, so she checked that he'd finished with them before using them to light her fires in the big black range that heated water, cooked their food, and kept the house from freezing in winter. When Pam had read about the terrible loss of life in the papers once more, she had wept again for the young men who were so valiantly giving their lives in the fierce struggle to keep the Germans at bay. The fact that two of her sons, Tom and John, were amongst those fighting made her sick with anxiety, and she'd flicked away her tears, giving herself a mental shake. At the moment, the prevailing mood was fear, and she wasn't the only mother terrified for her sons and fearful of invasion and losing this war that did not seem to be going well for Britain and her allies. It wouldn't do to give way to her fears. She worried for her boys, but she was also very proud of them. Tom, her firstborn, was in the army, and John, her youngest boy, had recently joined the RAF, and she had no idea what he was up to because he seldom wrote to her. When he did, his letters would be bright and cheerful, telling her about the fun he was having, but never mentioning the war or the serious side to his work. John would not want to upset her or cause her anxiety, but she worried all the same. Not that she had time on her hands to worry. Her second son, Artie, was still at home and working on the land with his father. She had two daughters, Susan and Angela, both of whom were lovely girls and gave their mother pleasure. She had great hopes for Susan's future because she wanted to train as a teacher. And Angela was only 8 and not old enough to know what she wanted to do when she grew up. Tom's wife, Lizzie, a clever young woman who owned a hairdressing salon in a small market town nearby, was living with them, to say nothing of the toddler Tina, who often brought a smile to Pam's lips. Tina was the granddaughter of Vera Salmons and the niece of Jeanie, a friend of Lizzie's since she'd lodged with her family in London. Together, with the land girls they employed, it made for a full household at breakfast time, and Pam was always busy cooking, washing, and cleaning. Tina had come to them after the tragic death of her mother. Her grandmother, Vera, was a midwife and unable to take the child at present. Tina's father, Terry, was still in hospital, months after being badly injured soon after the start of the war in 1939. He'd lost a leg, but his condition wasn't helped by the death of his wife due to a fire at the flats where she and Tina had been living. It was a miracle that Tina had survived, and her grandmother would have preferred to look after her herself. But with both her daughters away, Jeanie working as a land girl on Blackberry Farm and Annie as a nurse, Vera hadn't felt able to cope with the child. Tina had initially come to the farm for a short time, but the weeks and then months had passed, and so far, Vera hadn't asked to take her home. Pam secretly hoped she wouldn't. Tina was safer here with them. Just then, Susan came downstairs, holding the little girl by the hand. Pam smiled, her little fit of the blues blown away by Tina's smile, and the way she held her arms out to be taken up on Gangan's lap and fed her breakfast. "You going to study for your exams today?" Pam asked Susan, as Angela entered the kitchen and gave her mother an old-fashioned look. She'd been the baby of the family until Tina's arrival, and she might be a tiny bit jealous of the little girl. "No, Mum," Susan said in answer. "I have plenty of time to study before I take my exams. I did most of my homework last night, so if you need me to look after Tina or anything..." "You can give Tina a breakfast if you like." She looked fondly at her daughter. "How are your studies going, Susan?" "Fine, Mum," Susan said, and reached for Tina to take her on her lap and feed her the bread and butter soldiers with her soft-boiled egg. Living on the farm, they got fresh eggs regularly from Pam's chickens, and she made her own farm butter. But there was never enough, because they had to meet their quota for the milk board. "What do you want for breakfast, Angela?" Pam asked. "There's a boiled egg or jam and toast?" "I'd like some toast with your blackberry jelly, Mum, if you have any." "Yes, there's a fresh pot in the pantry," Pam told her. She hadn't had enough sugar last autumn to make as many jars of jam from the beautiful blackberries that gave the farm its name, because the papers had warned against hoarding, saying it was unfair to others. Arthur had said that some people were filling their attics with tinned goods that would become scarce, and suggested she should at least buy enough to fill the pantry shelves. But she'd felt it wasn't quite right, so she'd been sensible. Now that stuff like tinned or dried fruit was less available, and meat, fat, and sugar were rationed, she sometimes wished that she had. Although Arthur supplied them with eggs, milk, and some game, which meant there was normally plenty of food, the luxuries were becoming harder to find, perhaps because many people had hoarded them. However, Pam knew how to make the most of food, and she'd find alternative ways of cooking her family's favourites, as long as they all came back when the war was over. The thought of either Tom or John being wounded or killed made her shiver, as though someone was walking over her grave. As Susan fed Tina small fingers of bread and butter spread with margarine and her egg, Pam's thoughts returned to the men fighting what was clearly a hard and horrible war. She offered a silent prayer that her sons would return. Tom had his wife, Lizzie, though not yet a child to come back for. And John had a lovely girl named Faith Goodjohn, a lively 18-year-old who worked as a nurse in Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge and was extremely pretty. John had brought her home on a brief visit when he'd got leave, soon after he'd joined the RAF. She'd seemed a sweet-natured girl, but they hadn't stayed long, and it was weeks ago now. Pam wondered how Faith was getting on in her nursing training, and whether she'd had a letter from her son. "Is there any more toast, Ma?" At the sound of her second son's voice, Pam came out of her daydream and smiled at Artie. He'd had his breakfast earlier, before he'd gone milking, but had just returned and was clearly hungry again. His father entered a few seconds later and headed for his chair by the fire to pick up his paper. The headlines screaming news of the ongoing Battle of Britain in the skies. Named for his father, Artie was the one who looked the most like Arthur. Strong, hefty, with square features that made him look as if he was stern or dour. Neither her husband nor her son was as handsome as Tom's father had been. Her Tommy, who had died in the first big war with Germany before they could be wed. Yet she loved them both. Arthur was a good husband who had taken her when she was a young girl, unmarried with a new baby in arms, and Artie was a dependable son. He'd chosen to remain on the land, not because he was a coward, but because he genuinely loved farming and considered that his father would need help. Help he could not get from the land girls. Good as they were, they still needed a strong man about the place at times, and Artie was certainly that, Pam thought. "I'll make you some fresh toast and another pot of tea," she said. "Do you want jam or an egg, Artie?" "I'd like some dripping if you have any," he said, and smiled. Pam nodded and went to the pantry to fetch it. She saved her dripping fat from the meat because it was so useful in cooking and needed more than ever these days. But Artie had always loved it on toast, even as a young lad, the only one of her children who really liked it. "Will you be home for Docky?" she asked. "Or shall I pack you some food for the day?" "I'll be hoeing down the fen," Artie said. "I've got 10 acres of beet to clean. It's not hard work, and Jeannie will be helping me, so you'd best pack food for her too." "Where is Jeannie?" Pam asked, but the kitchen door opened at that moment and the land girl came in with a jug brimming with milk straight from the cow. "You've been a long time this morning?" Pam questioned. "It's Daisy," Jeannie said, and glanced at Arthur, who was drinking tea behind his newspaper. "She kept kicking. I think she may have a sore teat, Mr. Talbot. Do you want to take a look at her?" Arthur put down the paper and looked across at her. "Is it discoloured?" "It looks a bit reddish." "I'll take a look," Arthur said, and got up. "No, you sit there, Jeannie, and have your breakfast. If she needs the vet, I'll give him a call. Daisy had mastitis last year. I hope she isn't getting another bout." "Daisy is one of Arthur's favourites," Pam remarked as her husband left the kitchen. "The vet advised him to buy another cow and let her go last year, but he wouldn't. He says she still has some good years in her yet, and I doubt he'll let her be slaughtered if he can nurse her through it." "I never knew cows had problems with their teats until I came here," Jeannie said, laughed and added, "I never really knew what cows look like." She started spreading jam on her toast. "This is really lovely, Pam," she squenched happily. "I like Daisy too. She's usually so placid. I hope she doesn't have to be sent for slaughter." "It's a fact of life," Pam said. "But don't look so upset, Jeannie. Arthur will save her if he can." "It's only a cow, for goodness sake," Artie said. "If she's no use for milking, it's time she went. We can't afford sentimentality, especially now." "Artie!" Pam shot him a look. "Maybe that's true, but you could have some respect for Jeannie's feelings." "It's all right, Pam. I know he is right," Jeannie said. "I'm making sandwiches for your Docky, Jeannie," Pam said, and gave her son a warning glare. "Would you like cheese or Marmite?" "Could I have a round of each, please?" Jeanie smiled. "I do like Marmite, but the cheese you make is scrumptious with vinegar and pepper." Pam nodded. The soft white cheese she made when she could get enough cream and milk was delicious, and all her family liked it. "A couple of each, then," she said. "And I've got some apple pastries made with bottled fruit. I'll put one in for each of you." "Thanks," Jeanie said, and smiled at her. "You spoil me." "You work hard," Pam said, and rustled up the sandwiches in no time. As Jeanie scooped up her sandwiches and tucked them in her haversack, along with a bottle of tea, she was ready, still munching the toast as Artie led the way out to the farmyard. Susan and Angela following a moment later. Pam started to clear away her table. Everyone was out at work now, apart from Angela, who had gone to play with a school friend, and Susan, who had taken Tina out for a walk. She would be on her own until lunchtime. As she began to plan her work for the day, Pam's thoughts turned once more to the family who were not with her. Tom and John, and that pretty young girl John had taken such a fancy to. Pam wondered if it would ever come to anything between John and Faith. Chapter 2. Faith Goodjohn smiled as she picked up her letter in the reception area of the nurses' accommodation. It was from John Talbot. They had been courting for nearly a year now, and it made her feel better after a hard day on the wards of Addenbrooke's Hospital to read his latest letter. Faith was in her first few months of training, and as a lowly probationer, she got all the worst jobs. Her hands were sore from scrubbing bedpans, and her feet ached from hours of standing. A sigh broke from her. When would she be allowed to look after patients? She'd thought, with all the wounded soldiers and every bed occupied, so many that they were starting to set up temporary wards to accommodate them all, that she would be helping on the ward straight away. But most of her time was spent in the sluice room, attending lectures or scrubbing floors. "You have to learn to walk before you can run," Sister Reese had told her when she'd asked when she would be allowed to help on the wards. "You young girls think you know everything, when in fact you know nothing of any use when you come to us." Faith had felt like a scolded cat when Sister Reese had finished, but she'd stuck her head in the air and returned to the sluice room, determined not to be beaten. "You look as tired as I feel," one of the other probationers, Janice, grinned at Faith when they met at the top of the stairs of the nurses' home that evening. "We must be mad to do this. My sister Jean is working in Woolworths and getting paid more for selling sweets than I get." "Lucky her," Faith groaned. "I got on the wrong side of Sister Reese this morning, and she's had me on the run all day." "Rotten bitch," Janice said. "Fancy going out for a drink later? I'm meeting some of the other girls. And some men, too." She rolled her eyes at Faith. "It's ages since I had a date. My Tony is in the Navy and I haven't seen him in months." "He wouldn't go out with another man, Janice." "Tony said he didn't mind me having fun as long as I didn't sleep around," Janice replied. "It's only a drink, Faith. Come on, loosen up a bit. If you study every night, you'll die of boredom. Besides, you're like me, only doing your bit for the war, aren't you?" "Yes, I suppose so." That was all it was meant to be at the start, but she discovered she really enjoyed nursing. Faith hesitated and then nodded. She liked Janice Prentice, and she did need a little fun. It was hard work, and she'd had enough of sitting in her room every night. Of late, she wondered if she should give it up and go home to March, the thriving railway town in the Fens where she'd been born. Her boyfriend, John Talbot, was away most of the time. They'd been going out for several months before he'd joined the RAF, but although he'd told her he was in love with her, they were not engaged. He thought that she was too young to think of getting married and believed it was best to wait until things settled down. John was a brilliant plasterer and had his future mapped out for him in the building trade when the war was over. However, he'd wanted to join the RAF rather than the army and had done so as soon as he could. It was what they'd both agreed, but she missed him a lot. "All right, I'll come to the pub for a while," she agreed now. "Give me half an hour to get ready, and I'm not stopping out late. I should be dead on my feet tomorrow if I do." Janice smiled. "I'm just going to the shop. I'll knock on your door in half an hour." Faith ran to her room. It was small and plain, apart from her personal things. Hot and airless in these first days of August. The whole place felt a bit like a prison, with all the rules and restrictions. Like when they could take a bath, and what time they had to be home at night, and that no pets were allowed. Once inside, she flung down her bag, John's letter, and her coat. She wanted a wash and a cup of tea before changing into fresh clothes. Her hands smelled of carbolic and disinfectant. She would have to be quick if she was going out, which meant that John's letter would have to wait. Half an hour later, Faith was wearing a pretty green dress that set off her fair hair and blue-green eyes. She had cut her hair shorter when she'd started work at the hospital, after discovering that she just didn't have time to look after it. Her lipstick was bright red, and she wore a string of beads round her neck. When she opened her door to Janice, she smiled in approval. "Transformation," she said, and grabbed her arm. "Gosh, you smell nice. Real perfume. What luxury." "John bought it for me," Faith told her. "It's Chanel." "No wonder you smell gorgeous," Janice sighed. "Tony would never buy me anything like that. A box of chocolates and a pair of silk stockings if I'm lucky." "I'm always running out of stockings," Faith remarked wryly. "It's just as well we have to wear those awful Lyle ones for work." "I'm the same," Janice agreed. "I wish we could wear trousers like the men do. Then we wouldn't have to bother. I'm thinking of getting a pair for off-duty." The only trouble with silk stockings was that unless they were fully fashioned, they wrinkled around the ankles. "You're brave to consider wearing trousers," Faith said, and laughed. "I'm not sure I would dare, but it is a good idea." "Live dangerously," Janice advised teasingly. "Let's both get a pair and wear them at the same time. I dare you." "I'll think about it," Faith said, squeezing her arm. "I'm so glad we decided to go out this evening." "You wait till you see Slash and Rocky," Janice said. "They're both in the army and gorgeous. Bags me, Rocky. He's dreamy." "You can have them both," Faith replied. "I'm only interested in having a chat and a laugh." Janice raised her brows. "You haven't seen 'em yet." Faith shook her head. She was in love with John and had no wish to date another man. Slash and Rocky were waiting for them as part of a group. Several nurses and men in uniform had gathered in the King's Arms for a drink, and someone was playing a piano, knocking out one of the popular songs of the war. The atmosphere was warm and friendly, and after a couple of lemonade shandies, Faith was feeling relaxed, the frustration of her day melting away in the mellow buzz of friendship. Off duty, the nurses were approachable. Young women who whizzed by with hardly a glance her way during working hours, now unbent enough to smile and talk. "Take no notice of Sister Reese," one of the staff nurses told her. "She's a rotten bitch. I think she's frustrated in love, or had a bitter experience in the past. She always takes it out on the probationers, but you'll be moved on in a few weeks and things will improve." Faith thanked her and then turned as Slash tapped her on the shoulder. He was a tall, fair-haired soldier, thin and wiry, but attractive with a really nice smile. "Do you dance?" he asked her. Several couples were dancing a kind of smooch to the music. Faith loved to dance, but she didn't know this man well enough to be held that close. She shook her head and saw the disappointment in his face. "Sorry, I need to be getting back," she said. "Another hour, and they lock the door at the nurse's home. We have to be in by 10, and I don't want to get locked out." She glanced at Janice, who was just preparing to dance with Rocky, a big, hunky man with dark hair, and called out to her, "I'm going back now before they lock the doors. Are you coming?" "No, I'll stay a bit longer," she replied. "You could have another half an hour if we get a lift. Rocky has a car." "Thanks, I'll walk," Faith said. "See you in the morning." "May I walk you home?" Slash asked her. "I don't like to see a young girl walk home alone." "It isn't dark," Faith said, because it was summer and a lovely light night. She hesitated then. "I have a boyfriend, but if you want to walk with me, we can talk, but nothing more." "Right, that's fine with me." His face brightened. "You're a nice girl, Faith, and I'm glad you told me about the boyfriend. Is he in the army?" "John joined the RAF a few months ago," Faith said as they left the pub together. "They are a brave bunch," Slash said, nodding. "If it were not for those young pilots, I think the invasion would be underway by now. But they are beating the Luftwaffe in the air from what I hear." "John is still training, I think," Faith said. "He doesn't say much about his work." "Probably can't," Slash said. It was warm that evening, and she could smell some kind of night-scented flower in the air. She smiled as the tall man matched his steps to hers, and they strolled towards the nurse's accommodation, which was a few streets away and not far from the hospital itself. Addenbrooke's was set back in its grounds, and there were cherry trees opposite, lining the street, not far from the ancient colleges and the Fitzwilliam Museum. "John's elder brother, Tom, is in the army, though. You might know him? Sergeant Gilbert. He was promoted only a few months after he joined." He shook his head. "Must be a special bloke, then. Me and Rocky have been in since before the start, and they haven't promoted either of us." Faith shrugged. "I don't know John's brother, really. I've met Tom's wife and John's mother and father, but not the rest of his family. John takes me out as often as he can, but hasn't had leave for a while." "Bloomin' war," Slash nodded. "It's messed a lot of relationships up. My sister was nearly engaged before her boyfriend went off to fight. Poor devil got killed in his first action." "Oh, don't," Faith said, her heart contracting with fear. "I don't want any of the people I know to get killed. I've got an uncle in the army too, Uncle Ralph. I didn't think he was going to join up because Mum said he had a weak chest, but he did. I don't think they will send him overseas to fight. He's working in supplies or something." "Jammy," Slash said. "That's where the clever ones end up. They do all right. Most of them are scroungers. No offence to your uncle, but that's what the chaps reckon." Faith shrugged. "Uncle Ralph has plenty of money." She felt a coolness at her nape. Once upon a time, she'd thought Uncle Ralph was wonderful. But then she'd started to feel a little unsure about him. Something in his manner had changed, and she'd wondered why. But she didn't want to think about that now. Faith shrugged, changing the subject once more. "Why don't you tell me about you and your sister?" He smiled. "I'd much rather hear about you. You're nursing, aren't you?" "I'm learning," Faith smiled. "I was feeling a bit fed up this evening. That's why I came out." She told him about Sister Reese, and he made a face. "We've got some of that sort in the army," he said, and stopped walking as they reached the nurse's home. "Well, it looks as if we're here. It was nice talking to you, Faith. I'd ask you to the pictures, but we're off in the morning. Maybe when we get back. whenever that is." "Maybe," Faith agreed. He was pleasant, and she didn't see why she shouldn't make a few friends, male as well as female. John wouldn't expect her to stay home every night. Later, she read John's letter twice. He was really enjoying himself in the RAF, learning lots of new things and looking forward to seeing her when he got leave. "I hope you're having a good time nursing. Enjoy yourself, Faith, and make the most of it. I love you, you know that, but none of us knows what is coming next. We lose chaps most days here, and it makes you aware of how short life can be. If we get together after the war, I'd like us to marry, but I'm not holding you to a promise. Have fun, my love, and think of me sometimes. That's all I ask. Not sure when I'll get leave, but keep a free day for me when I do. Love, John." Tears stung her eyes as she folded the letter. It had brought his kindness and consideration back to her. John was a lovely person, and she missed him. For a moment, she felt a sharp pang of loneliness and wished John was with her. His words had brought home the imminence of danger, and she felt her throat catch with anguish. If anything happened to John, she didn't think she could bear it, and she realised that he meant more to her than she'd thought he would at the start. It had sort of crept up on her without her knowing until now. She was suddenly glad that Slash hadn't been able to take her to the cinema. Yes, there were times when she needed to have fun, and she'd enjoyed their walk. But she loved John. It was just hard to bear when they didn't see each other for months. But perhaps he would get leave soon. Chapter 3. Ralph Harris yawned as he looked around the army stores at the base he'd been assigned to in Colchester. It was convenient for him, not too arduous a journey if he wished to get home, but far away enough from London and the gaze of a certain police inspector. Ralph avoided visits to London these days, hoping that the nosy policeman had forgotten him and the murder of those gangsters he'd killed. Nothing had ever been proved against Ralph in the matter of the gangland killing. He got away with it, but it had cost him. The nightclub he'd owned was no longer his, and he'd had to lie low for a while, hence his decision to join up, even though he could have got an exemption for a weak chest. He didn't regret killing those men who had been threatening his club. He'd done it in cold blood and made sure the gun he'd used could never be traced back to him. Although he'd come under suspicion, there were no leads back to the dead man. His sister thought he was wonderful. Her husband was more reserved, but had known nothing of his other life. To them and his pretty niece, Faith, he was just the generous brother and uncle he'd always been. Faith had taken up with Tom Gilbert's half-brother, John Talbot. Ralph had met him, and he seemed to be a hard-working man, more reserved than his elder brother. It didn't suit Ralph that a member of his family should have anything to do with Tom, the man he hated so much. It made his guts burn. But she was young, and it probably wouldn't come to anything. He hadn't said a great deal to her about it yet, just a few veiled hints that she might be making a mistake. But as long as Talbot didn't get in his way, he was willing to let that rest for now. He had other things on his mind. At home in March, Cambridgeshire, he was simply a respectable businessman who had done his duty and joined up. Only to that high and mighty bitch that Tom Gilbert had married had he shown the other side of his nature. He'd threatened Lizzie Gilbert one night because she'd made him angry, and if he ever got the chance, both she and her husband would feel the cold steel of his revenge. Tom had ignored him at school, where he'd been the perfect head boy, and Ralph had struggled to keep up at sports, and that had rankled. Tom had reported him as being unfit to play in the school teams, and so Ralph had lost his chance to join in the glory of their successes. He'd felt bitter about that, and they'd become enemies as they'd grown up. Years later, Tom had humiliated him in public by knocking him down after he'd made some remarks about Lizzie. And Ralph didn't take that treatment lightly. He would pay him and his wife back one day. Somehow. When this stupid war was over and the police in London had forgotten all about him, he was just biding his time. He savoured the power he'd discovered in himself when he'd shot those criminals in London. They were scum, feeding off the hard work of others with their protection racket. He'd shot them, ridding the world of men who weren't fit to live, in his opinion. For perhaps the first time in his life, he'd felt euphoria. But then that police inspector had got a bit too interested. Yet, having experienced such power, the power to take life, had given Ralph a taste for it. He knew that having killed twice, he could do it again, and when the time was right, he would take revenge on Tom Gilbert and others. Maybe even that nosy police inspector, if he got in his way again. There wasn't much in the way of profit for Ralph stuck here. If he'd been in charge of the guns and ammunition, he would have had a few outlets for those. But they were kept elsewhere, and he didn't have the keys to access them or the authority to deal with them. Ralph had not been issued with a gun by the army. He didn't need one because he wouldn't be going to the war. His job was safe because of his weak chest. "We can't let you fight," he'd been told when the army doctor had confirmed there was a shadow on Ralph's lungs, and suggested that he might also have a slight heart malfunction. "Your heart isn't going to give out on you, old chap," the doctor had said heartily, "but you might be a liability to your comrades if we put you in the field." "I can work," Ralph had retorted, apprehensive that they were going to turn him down. In civilian life, he had been afraid that his time as a free man might be limited. By joining up, he'd hoped to escape arrest for the murder of those men. "You must have work that it would be a waste for a fully fit soldier to do." His persistence had impressed the doctor. "Yes, there are always administrative jobs," the doctor had agreed. He'd seemed to hesitate then. "You obviously want to do your bit, so I'm going to recommend you for light duties. You seem to me to be an intelligent chap. Maybe there's a job they can find for you." Ralph had assumed he would be put to work in an office or taken into the intelligence and planning department. It would suit him to be in the know, but he'd been stuck here in the stores, and it was boring. Ralph's thoughts returned to Tom Gilbert. A scowl touched his attractive face as he thought of his rival. It was the way he still thought of Tom. At a school that prized sportsmen, he'd never been good enough. Everyone clustered around Tom, and he'd taken it all in his stride. And then he'd beaten Ralph in the local darts match the previous year, and that had niggled Ralph so much that he'd let his temper show. He'd said something Tom Gilbert objected to, and they'd fought. But, of course, his rival had won, and made a fool of him in front of everyone. That bastard thought himself so clever, but Ralph would bring him down as soon as he got the chance. He'd also laid claim to one of the best-looking girls in the area, one who Ralph had fancied. He'd taken what he wanted from Lizzie, forcing her, though for a while that hadn't been enough, and he'd wanted much more from her. He'd tried to persuade her to be his woman. If he could have taken her from Tom Gilbert, it would have been very sweet revenge. But she'd turned him down, and that had made him even more angry. One day, he would have the opportunity to put that bastard in his place, and his snooty wife with him. A smile touched Ralph's face. They didn't know who they were dealing with. No one in his local area dreamed of what he was capable of. But Gilbert and his wife would find out. Ideally, he would kill them both. But that took planning, because he wasn't prepared to get caught. Ralph came out of his dreams of revenge as an officer entered the stores. He saluted smartly and was rewarded with a nod of approval.
"Ah, Harris," the officer said. "You're the chappie in charge here?"
"Yes, Captain Whittaker. Is there a problem?"
"On the contrary, old chap. Before you took charge, there was a lot of petty pilfering going on. Mainly boots. The men are forever needing new ones, and a lot of boots were unaccounted for. All that has stopped."
"I do my best, sir."
"Yes, you do. And that's why I want you in charge of the officers' mess bar."
Captain Whittaker grinned.
"The odd pair of boots goes astray? Who cares? If it's my 20-year-old malt whiskey, it's a disaster. We need someone we can trust, and I think you're the one. If you'd care for the job, of course."
"Delighted to be asked, sir," Ralph said promptly. At last he was getting somewhere. There were bound to be opportunities at the mess for a clever man, and not necessarily the odd bottle of whiskey.
"I'll arrange for a replacement here, then." Captain Whittaker smiled at him and walked out again.
Ralph laughed. His luck was in. Selling the odd pair of boots hadn't appealed because there wasn't enough money in it. He would find the officers' mess far more interesting. Men like Captain Whittaker got drunk when relaxing with their friends and fellow officers. They let things slip. Little snippets that a man with intelligence could use for blackmail and profit. He would wait for a while, until the right moment. A chance for something that would give him what he wanted. Money was no problem. Ralph needed influential friends. A chance to blend in with the right people, to escape the notice of a certain nosy police officer who suspected what he couldn't prove. Of course, that police inspector might meet with an accident one day. If he got in Ralph's way, it could be arranged. But if it happened, Ralph needed to be in the clear. Ralph needed a free hand when the time came for him to take his revenge on Tom Gilbert and his wife, and the best way to do that was to rise in the world. He was better than the manager of the stores or of the officers' mess. But with the right friends, Ralph could become what he needed to be. A gentleman above suspicion. Chapter 4. It was so long since she'd had a letter from Tom. Lizzie Gilbert had hoped she might hear something after the evacuation of Dunkirk, but months had passed since then, and so far, nothing had come. That had been such a tense time for the whole country. The realization that most of the British army was stranded on the beaches of France and could be captured or killed was horrifying. The evacuation had been a desperate thing, because unless Britain could get her men out, the war was over and Germany had all but won. Lizzie had wept when she saw pictures in the paper and on the Pathé News during a visit to the cinema. Those brave men in their little fishing boats going out in their hundreds to help rescue the soldiers stranded. It was all so brave and so very British, so mad and impossible. But they'd got them back, the wounded and those able to walk. It was a miracle. Yet since then, the Germans had stepped up their attacks on British cities. Birmingham, Cardiff amongst others, mostly heavily industrial. And then they'd started their blitz on London. Lizzie worried for her friends there, but Vera had told her that so far her street had escaped the bombing. Now, most of the summer had passed, and it was early September. All these months apart from Tom, and they'd had so little time together that her heart ached with the need for him at times. She just wished a letter would come so that she knew he was all right. Lizzie finished cleaning the basins in her hairdressing salon in Chatteris, just a few miles from her home at Blackberry Farm, and then rinsed her hands. She was finished for the day, and it was just 6:30. Because it was still late summer and the nights were light, she would cycle home rather than waiting for the next bus. Sometimes she got a lift with her brother-in-law, if Artie had been to March or was in Chatteris on farm business. Lizzie didn't mind the cycle ride in the summer, but hoped to pass her driving test one day, though they had been suspended for the duration of the war. She had a provisional licence, which she'd obtained before the new act, and hoped that meant she could drive without someone with her once she felt confident. In another month or two, she would be living in her own house. Lizzie wasn't sure how she felt about the move. A part of her was thrilled with the house that Arthur Talbot had kindly had built for them on land near the farm. It had taken a long time to take shape, several months, but it was getting there. It wasn't always easy to get all the raw materials because of the war, and the builder had only a few men to help him. Most, like Tom's brother John, had gone off to war, and the builder, Jack Freeman, was working almost single-handedly on much of the house. Lizzie was looking forward to having her own home to decorate and make cosy for her and Tom, except that she enjoyed living with her mother-in-law and the rest of the family. Pam Talbot was such a warm, caring person, very different from Lizzie's own mother. Lizzie didn't always get on with her mother, though she visited her once a fortnight at the home she shared with her friend Mabel in the nearby town of March. Lizzie and her mother had lived together not far from Blackberry Farm until she'd quarrelled with Tom in March 1939 and left the area to work at a hairdressing salon in London. She'd enjoyed her time there, entering a lot of prestigious hairstyling competitions. She'd lived with Vera and her husband and 2 daughters, Annie and Jeannie, but she'd still loved Tom. So, when he asked her to marry him, she'd return to live at his home. They'd married as soon as Tom got leave from the army. She'd missed him terribly when they were estranged, and she still did when he was away from her. Sometimes she lay in bed at night, wondering what he was doing and if he was well and thinking of her. All the men in the forces were in danger, but Lizzie had sensed that what her husband was doing was different. He'd joined an East Anglian regiment at the beginning, but was now with an elite group that so far had no name and was secret. And she wasn't even supposed to know that much, but she'd guessed what Tom couldn't tell her, and she knew it must be risky and dangerous. Damn this war, Lizzie swore beneath her breath. Why did it have to happen? Why could things not go back to how they used to be? She just wished she knew where he was and if he was thinking of her. Tom Gilbert stared out of the window at the creeping fog rolling in off the restless waves. Even in summer, the mist often blew in from the sea in this secret location in the salt marsh on the east coast of England, making it seem even more isolated, cut off from the world. Being part of a stealth attack group, everything had to be hush-hush, and they'd been warned never to talk of what they did to anyone but their comrades. When they went behind enemy lines, it had to be in and out quickly, or they'd have no chance of success. You got used to being reserved with others, but not with your family. That was hard. It was on mornings like this that he most missed his wife, Lizzie, his family, and the fenland farm that was his home. Strange and ridiculous how a sea mist could cause such a feeling of loneliness. Tom shook his head as if to clear it of the foolish thoughts. He should write to Lizzie and to his mother, but in truth, he'd had little time of late. Earlier in the year, he and his comrades had been heavily involved in the defence of Norway, mostly helping to get people out. Despite the fact that Germans were now in control of that country, Tom knew there were still small groups of men prepared to resist. He hoped the British were not going to give up on them and would offer help. There was talk of another mission, and he wondered if they were going back, secretly this time. "Hey, Tom,"
You haven't forgotten the briefing in half an hour?" Shorty Linton put his head round the door and grinned at him. The tall, lanky soldier, so mockingly named, was Tom's best friend in the army. Tom had helped to save his life when Shorty was badly wounded on their first mission, and his friend made it his business to look out for Tom, sticking to him like glue through whatever they faced, in the camp or on a mission. Shorty reckoned Tom was his lucky charm. Shorty was completely recovered now, and they had spent the past few weeks training for their next mission. Rumours were flying around about where they were being sent this time, but one thing they were all certain of was that it was risky and dangerous. There had been a lot of activity, comings and goings of high-ranking officials having secret meetings. Some of the men said their little group might be swallowed up by something much bigger that was being formed, but the men hadn't been told anything officially yet. "No, I hadn't forgotten," Tom said, and glanced at the watch his mother had given him on his 25th birthday. "I was going to write to Lizzie and Ma too if I get time." "Best not," Shorty said. "We've been told to report half an hour early. The captain wants a private word." "Right, I hadn't heard. The message came through just a few minutes ago. Jenks was supposed to tell you, but I thought I'd check and make sure he had." "Must have slipped his mind," Tom said. Jenks was a member of their group, what you might call a lone wolf, and handy with a knife and his fists. He was also a good shot and useful when they were in a tight spot, but Tom considered him reckless. He'd caught him sleeping when he should have been on watch on their last mission, and warned him what could happen if their team leader, Sergeant Phillips, had found him. Jenks had shrugged and then spat on the ground, showing that he didn't care. Recently, since Tom had been made team leader, Jenks had been showing some resentment. Tom wasn't 100% sure they could trust him, and yet his skills were second to none. And perhaps for the kind of work they were expected to do, you had to accept a certain amount of attitude. The missions they undertook, and they'd been on several now, including a recent successful one to the Channel Islands to get someone important out, were precarious, apt to backfire. So far, they'd been lucky, and perhaps it was that good fortune that had bonded them. Tom knew they had to trust each other, but Jenks wasn't easy to like. Tom walked to the briefing with his friend. They talked mainly about Shorty's love life. He was courting their officer's daughter, very slowly and carefully, because he was afraid Captain Morris would forbid it if he knew. Tom grinned as he listened. Shorty was head over heels in love, and the girl of his dreams was the best cook they'd ever had at base camp. Unfortunately, she hadn't been able to move to the secret location with them, and the man who cooked for them here wasn't a patch on Carol Morris. Shorty was missing both her cooking and her company, and he was worried because he hadn't had a letter since they'd been in their secret location. Mail was supposed to be passed on to them, but it didn't come regularly, and Tom reassured his friend that it was probably the army's fault rather than Carol's. He smiled as he thought of the letter he would send to Lizzie. There were no shops nearby, but he'd hidden a gift for her birthday in his parents' house, and another for their wedding anniversary if he wasn't back in time. His mother knew where they were, and she would make sure Lizzie got them. Maybe he would be home himself. After this next mission, he was surely due some leave. Chapter 5. Pam Talbot was looking eagerly out of the kitchen window when the motorbike roared into the farmyard and a young man wearing RAF uniform hopped off the pillion seat, spoke to the driver of the bike, and then turned towards the house. The bike zoomed off without so much as a nod to the house. Pam waved furiously, and the young man in uniform lifted his hand in return before breaking into a run in his eagerness to be home. "John, it is so good to see you,"
Pam cried as her youngest son burst into the kitchen, opening her arms to hug him.
"We've all missed you, love, and they are all looking forward to seeing you. Are you well? How is life in the RAF?"
John Talbot hugged his mother, lifting her from the ground and swinging her round before kissing her cheek.
"It's great, Ma,"
he said, and smiled at her, his handsome face alight with enthusiasm.
"I'm really glad I chose to join the Royal Air Force rather than the Army. They're a great bunch of chaps, especially the ground crew." "What are you going to be?" she asked as he released her. "And where's your kit?"
"I didn't bother bringing it from the station," John said. "I've got plenty of clothes here, and I'll pick it up from the locker when I catch the train after my home leave." There was something about the way he turned his head that warned Pam. Instead of asking more questions, she put a plate of hot pasties, some blackberry jam tarts, rock buns, and a mug of tea on the table, and John reached for a pasty and began to eat it immediately.
"How did you know I would be starving?"
he asked with his mouth full, and she laughed at his obvious pleasure in the simple food she'd prepared. The pasty pastry was crispy and filled with mincemeat, diced potatoes, and carrots, and tasted delicious. All her family enjoyed food like this, and with the meat rationing now, it was economical. She'd been up early to prepare it. Artie and Arthur would be back in from the field soon, and between them they would make short work of the meal.
"Because you were always hungry," she replied. "How long do you have with us, John?"
10 days, he said. "I've passed to be flying crew.
Meet Navigator John Talbot, Mrs. Talbot."
His smile lit his blue eyes that were so like her own, and Pam's heart jolted as he held out his hand for her to shake. She took it and lightly dropped a kiss on the back, smiling at his delight. This son, who took after her in so many ways, looked even more handsome in his uniform, and she'd missed him terribly these past months, but knew she couldn't show it. John was a man now, and he'd become independent and stronger since he left home. He looked fit and well, and the fact that he would be flying as a navigator, probably in bombers and risking his life night after night, seemed to thrill him. The sleepless nights it gave his mother were another thing, and not to be discussed or even hinted at.
"Congratulations," she murmured with a smile. "It's what you wanted, isn't it?"
"I'd have liked to be a pilot," he said.
"But I was considered to be a first-class navigator, so after they explained how important the job was, I decided to settle for that. After all, I'm not going to carry on flying once the war is over, am I? I already have my future sorted."
Pam nodded her satisfaction. John was young but so confident. He was a plasterer for a small firm of builders, and before he'd joined up, on reaching his 18th birthday, his boss made him a junior partner, because he wanted him back when the hostilities were over. Jack Freeman valued his skills and liked him, so he'd made sure John wouldn't get lured away to another building firm by giving him shares in the business. Not that there was much profit to be made at the moment. The war had certainly put the mockers on the building trade, as it had on so many businesses. Though after the recent bombing in London, there would probably be plenty of work there and in other cities, clearing debris and making damaged buildings safe. From what Pam had seen in the papers, the damage was horrendous. She was glad none of her family lived in town. Lizzie had for a while when she'd fallen out with Tom, but thankfully she'd come home when they made it up and married.
"I think Jack has almost finished Lizzie's house," Pam said as John ate another pasty. "Would you like some more tea?"
She looked round as the door opened, and her husband and Artie entered.
"Your own men, John,"
Arthur said, and came to clap him on the shoulder.
"You look smart, lad. I hope you're not too posh to give us a hand while you're here. I know you're not keen on the farming, John, but you might give us a day with the potato harvesting if you have time." I don't mind helping one day, John said. Jack did say he would like me to do a bit of work on Lizzie's house for him if I had time. You're supposed to be on leave. A holiday, Pam protested, and Artie snorted his disgust. Come on, Ma, he said. Those flyboys do little but sit about half the time. They don't know what work is. He gave his brother a friendly punch in the arm. Isn't that so, John? You should try the training and sit the exams, John retorted, but laughed because Artie was just joking. After the recent defence by the RAF, when Churchill had praised in a glowing speech about how much was owed by so many to so few, no one doubted the skill and courage of the men who defended the British skies. Anyone heard from Tom recently? No. Lizzie had a letter some months ago, but none of us have heard since, Pam said, and the anxiety was in her voice, even though she tried not to let it show. I expect he's just busy. They all are, John confirmed. How is Lizzie and little Tina? He glanced around the big kitchen. Oh, where is she? Susan took her out for a walk, Pam said. Susan ought to be revising for her exams. She'll be assessed when she goes back to school after the holidays, and then we'll know if she's going to college or not. I'm surprised she hasn't wanted to leave and apply for a volunteer group. Don't you dare suggest it to her, Pam said quickly. We want her to go on to college, become a teacher, have a little fun, not get married too young or be stuck in some dead-end job. Yes, she should have some fun at college before she settles down, he agreed. I like my job plastering, but I am enjoying my time in the RAF despite the war. Pam nodded. She could see that he was happy, and that made her smile. Arthur and Artie sat down at the table, and Pam made a fresh pot of tea. Where are the girls? She asked them. They're still spreading muck on that field we plan to plough in readiness for the winter veg this afternoon. Cabbages and sprouts are new to me, but we've been told we need 'em. So I'm using that corner bit that doesn't yield much in the way of main crops, Arthur replied. The new girl, Nancy, is driving Tom's tractor, and Jeannie was still unloading when we brought our trailer back. They had 2 tractors on the farm now. One, an old one that Tom had lovingly cared for since he'd persuaded his father it was easier to repair than catching the horses that had once done all the heavy work on the land. Since he'd been forced to rely on land girls, Arthur had bought another tractor, a bit newer this time. Pam shook her head at her son. Why didn't you give him a hand, Artie? I offered, but Nancy refused our help, told us to get off and have our lunch. She pointed out that if we want to finish this field before it rains, we need to get on, and they can manage. Jeannie agreed, so I came back with Dad. Artie seemed annoyed about something. Pam wondered what had upset him. Could it be something to do with the new girl, Nancy? Although Jeannie had stayed on at the farm, seeming quite content, the girl who had come with her, Mary, had moved on some months back. She'd married a small landowner and was now helping him in the fields. Her replacement had turned out to be useless and left, announcing she was pregnant a few weeks after she'd arrived. It had taken a while to get another girl because Arthur had been reluctant to go through the procedure again. Pam had pointed out that Arthur and Artie couldn't manage the land alone.